Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story. And tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
History, as is often noted, possesses a rather unfortunate habit of committing to memory only the loudest of sounds, the thunder of battles, the gnashing of swords, the triumphant speeches of victors, and the dying curses of the vanquished. It writes its pages in ink mixed with blood, and thus the image of Salazar Slytherin, preserved through the ages, is one hewn from cold granite and human fear. He is remembered as the Lord of Serpents, as the architect of gloomy dungeons, as a wizard whose name became synonymous with ambition bordering on cruelty and pride that knew no bounds. It is said that his heart was colder than the waters of the Black Lake in January, and his soul darker than the deepest corner of the Forbidden Forest. Students whispered that he subsisted solely on raw roots and basilisk venom, and that his laugh sounded like the cracking of dry bones. But history, for all its dignity, can often be short-sighted. It overlooks the quiet moments. It ignores what transpires when the torches in the Great Hall are extinguished, and the castle corridors sink into a deep, velvety slumber. The ancient stone walls of Hogwarts, having absorbed thousands of secrets, remember a remarkably different Salazar. They recall not only the hissing of Parseltongue that turns blood to ice, but another sound, far more prosaic, yet utterly astonishing for such a figure, the rhythmic, soothing sound of a silver whisk beating against the sides of a copper bowl. They remember not the stench of sulphur and dark magic, but the delicate, barely perceptible aroma of burnt sugar, vanilla and nutmeg, that, at 3 o'clock in the morning, would seep through the cracks of massive oak doors in the deepest dungeons. This was a secret known only to a few, the ghosts who happened to drift by, and perhaps the wise house elves, who knew how to hold their tongues better than any wizard. On that particular night, the castle slept a fitful sleep. The wind howled around the high towers, rattling the shutters of the Gryffindor common room, as if trying to reach those slumbering within. But here, deep underground in Slytherin's domain, there reigned an absolute, almost ringing silence. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of wet stone and the lake water pressing against the walls from outside. Salazar Slytherin walked slowly down the corridor. His steps were soundless, a habit born of years of dangerous living and political intrigue. His long robes of heavy emerald velvet rustled faintly against the floor, reminiscent of the movement of a great serpent. The expression on his face was stern, even gloomier than usual. Deep lines around his mouth lay in shadow, and in his eyes, the color of old moss, burned a cold, irritated light. The day had been dreadful. More than that, it had been catastrophic. The scene in the staff room replayed in Salazar's mind over and over again. Godric. Of course, it was Godric Gryffindor. Who else could so masterfully unsettle him? The argument had begun over a trifle, a discussion of the third-year curriculum for defense against the dark arts. But, as had happened so often between them of late, a spark had fallen upon the dry tinder of old grievances and philosophical differences. "You want to teach them to fear the shadow of their own wands, Salazar," Godric's voice had thundered, bouncing off the wall so that the portrait seemed to tremble. "We must foster bravery, the readiness to meet danger face to face, not to cower in corners studying counter-curses for threats that do not yet exist." "Caution is not cowardice, Godric," Salazar had replied then, his voice as quiet as a viper's hiss before a strike. yet ringing with icy fury. And recklessness is not bravery. You would send them to their deaths with a smile on their lips, whereas I wish for them to survive. To be prepared. The world is not as sunny and simple as it appears from the height of your tower, word for word, argument for argument. Fire against water. Passion against cold logic. Helga had tried to soothe them, offering chamomile tea. Rowena had merely rubbed her temples wearily, buried in her scrolls, realizing that logic would be of no avail here. But they had not stopped. Salazar had said things that now, in the silence of the dungeons, he regretted. He had called Godric a short-sighted fool in love with his own voice. Godric, in turn, had called him a soulless husk who sees enemies everywhere. The door had slammed. The silence that fell after the quarrel was heavier than the castle vaults. And so now, standing before a blank wall at the end of a blind corridor, Salazar felt the poison of unspoken words still swirling within him. He knew he was right in substance. He was always right in matters of security. But he also knew he had gone too far. Godric was his friend. His oldest friend. And the thought that this chasm between them was growing ever wider gnawed at him more fiercely than any dark curse. Apologize? No, Salazar Slytherin did not apologize. His tongue, capable of weaving the most complex spells and conversing with snakes, became wooden when required to utter a simple, sorry. Pride was his armor, but it was also his prison. But if words could not fall from his lips, perhaps there existed another way. A way that required no humiliation, yet carried a message of peace. The way of alchemy, not the kind that turns lead into gold, but the kind that transforms flour, sugar, and butter into pure emotion. Salazar raised his eyes to a stone bas-relief depicting a tangle of tree roots. No one else would have noticed an entrance here. To the untrained eye, it was simply part of the castle's foundation. He brought his face close to the stone and, barely audibly, on the very edge of hearing, hissed, "Sweet peace." It was the most astonishing password in all of Hogwarts. Not pure blood, not power, not greatness. Sweet peace. The stone vibrated. A sound was heard, like the deep sigh of a mountain, and part of the wall slid smoothly aside, revealing a passage. Warm golden light instantly flooded out, chasing away the cold shadows of the dungeon. Salazar crossed the threshold, and the door closed silently behind him, cutting him off from the rest of the world, from problems, from students, from the quarrelsome Godric. He found himself in his sanctuary. This room differed strikingly from everything associated with Slytherin House. There were no damp walls, no skulls, no pickled monstrosities in jars. The room was the perfect embodiment of coziness, brought to an absolute by magical precision. The walls were paneled in light wood, honey oak, which seemed to radiate the solar warmth accumulated over centuries. Endless shelves stretched along the walls, but they held not tomes of dark magic, but jars, thousands of glass, crystal, and porcelain jars of all shapes and sizes. In them were stored treasures more valuable to Salazar at this moment than all the goblin jewels, vanilla from Madagascar, the pods of which were black and shiny as snakeskin, cinnamon from the Far East, smelling of heat and adventure, rare cane sugar grown on volcanic soils, sparkling like crushed diamonds, dried rose petals gathered at dawn, nuts, berries, essences, oils. Each jar bore a label inscribed in Salazar's sharp calligraphy hand. In the center of the room stood a massive table of polished marble, a perfectly flat, cool surface for working with dough. And beside it, Salazar's pride, a vast oven, tiled with hand-painted ceramics. It required no wood. In its depths burned an eternal, magical fire, the temperature of which Salazar could control by the power of thought to within a single degree. It smelled not of dampness here, but of warm butter, toasted almonds, and tranquility. Salazar approached the coat rack. With one fluid movement, he removed his heavy velvet robes, remaining in a simple black shirt and trousers. He rolled up his sleeves, exposing pale forearms speckled with small scars from magical duels and potion experiments. But now, these hands would weave a different kind of magic. He put on an apron. It was not merely a piece of fabric, but a work of art. Dark green linen, embroidered with silver threads forming protective runes. Runes against burning, against milk souring, against dough falling. He walked to the copper basin, from the tap of which flowed spring water, and thoroughly washed his hands. It was a ritual. To wash away the day, to wash away the anger, to wash away the politics, leaving only the master. "Well then," Salazar said quietly into the emptiness of the room. His voice sounded different here, softer, deeper. "Glazed Marzipans of Peace. This must work. It has to work." He knew Godric's tastes. Godric liked simple, understandable things, but with a bold character. He would not appreciate the complex, multi-layered desserts that Rowena favored, or the overly sweet, homely pies of Helga. He needed something that had a hard shell but a soft, rich center. Something that initially offered resistance to the teeth, then melted, revealing sweetness. Marzipan, the symbol of hidden essence. Salazar began to move about the kitchen. His movements were a dance of economy and grace. He wasted not a single step. His left hand reached for the shelf for almonds, whilst his right was already retrieving a copper mortar. He chose almonds of a special variety, royal almonds, brought to him by merchants from southern lands. Each nut was flawless, without a single blemish. Salazar poured them into the mortar. He could have used magic to grind them in a second. One simple diffindo or reducto, and the nuts would have turned to dust. But he never did that. In cooking, as in the dark arts, intent is paramount. The sacrifice of time and effort is essential. Mechanical grinding kills the soul of the ingredient. Manual grinding releases it. He took the heavy pestle and began to work. Thock thock crunch. Thock thock crunch. The rhythmic sound filled the room, sending Salazar into a state bordering on a trance. With each strike, he pictured Godric's face. Thock. "You stubborn mule, Godric. Thock. But you are the only one unafraid to tell me the truth to my face. Crunch. I do not want you to perish because of your foolish bravery. Thock. I want to protect this castle. Protect us." The almonds turned into a fine, moist crumb, releasing a thick, oily fragrance. Salazar inhaled it deeply. The scent of bitterness and sweetness. Exactly what was needed. Friendship too is like that. Sometimes bitter as almond skin, but nourishing and necessary. Now for the icing sugar. He took a sieve, the finest mesh, woven by silkworm spiders. A gift from a forester acquaintance whose name Salazar would tell no one. He began to sift the sugar. A white cloud rose into the air, settling on his eyelashes like the first snow. In the light of the magical lamps, the sugar dust danced and shimmered, creating the illusion of a magical barrier. He weighed everything on the scales. These were not mere scales. They were scales of truth. On one pan he placed the ingredient, on the other, the standard. No, by eye. Chaos was impermissible. Perfection required discipline. 200 grams of almonds. 200 grams of sugar. 1 teaspoon of rose water. neither more nor less. Salazar mixed the dry ingredients in a large copper bowl. Copper is the best conductor of heat and magic. When he plunged his fingers into the mixture to rub it together, he felt the copper respond to his touch, warming slightly. He added egg white, only the white, no yolk, to preserve the purity of color and texture. And he began to knead. This was the most crucial moment. Marzipan dough is temperamental. It senses the baker's mood. If you are angry, it will crumble. If you are impatient, it will become sticky and weep. One must be firm, yet gentle, commanding, yet caring. Just as he ought to behave with his students, a thought flashed by, which he quickly banished. Salazar kneaded the pliable mass, feeling the structure appear beneath his fingers. It became smooth, elastic, yielding. It was soothing. In the world of politics and magic, everything was shaky, uncertain, full of betrayals and double meanings. Here, on the marble table, everything was honest. If you did everything right, you got the result. He rolled the dough into a perfect sphere. It was the color of ivory, matte and warm. He pinched off a tiny piece and tasted it. The flavor was correct, technically flawless, sweet, nutty, with a light floral aftertaste from the rosewater. Any confectioner in London would have sold their soul for this recipe. But Salazar frowned. He chewed slowly, analyzing the taste as one analyses a complex potion. Something was missing. The marzipan was delicious, but it was ordinary. It lacked that spark which could melt the ice between two powerful wizards. It was merely food. And he needed a message. He needed the taste of reconciliation. Reconciliation is not just sweetness. It is the feeling of relief after long tension. It is like a breath of fresh air after suffocation. It is the peace of night after a scorching day. Salazar looked at his ingredients. He had the best that gold could buy. But what he needed could not be bought with gold. He walked to the window, or rather the enchanted window, which showed not the underwater world of the lake, as in the common room, but reflected what was happening on the surface. Up there, a full moon was shining. A vast silver disk hung over the tops of the forbidden forest, flooding the world with ghostly radiance. Salazar's eyes narrowed. He recalled a legend he had read in an ancient druidic scroll in his youth. A legend of a flower called Noctis Pax, night peace, or, as the common folk called it, moon's tear. It is said that the nectar of this flower has the property of soothing even the fiercest beasts, quelling anger, and granting clarity of mind. But there was one problem. This nectar could not be gathered by summoning magic. It evaporates at any crude interference. It appears only for a few minutes on the night of a full moon in the deepest thicket of the forest, and can be gathered only by one who comes with peace in their heart and patience in their soul. Salazar glanced at his unfinished marzipan, then at the moon, then at his hands, dusted with icing sugar. Madness, he muttered. I, Salazar Slytherin, am to run through the forest for flower juice, like a first year in herbology class. But he was already taking off his apron. He knew he would go, because the marzipans had to be perfect. Because Godric, despite everything, was his brother in spirit. And because Salazar Slytherin never did anything by halves. He threw his robes over his shirt, took a small crystal vial from the table, and casting a final glance at the warm oven, headed for the exit. The forest awaited him. And this time, he went there not as a conqueror, but as a supplicant. The dungeon shadows parted to let him pass, and the scent of burnt sugar remained hanging in the air like a promise that he would surely return. When the heavy oak doors of Hogwarts Castle closed behind Salazar Slytherin, The silence of the night enveloped him like a second cloak. Here, on the boundary between civilization and the wild, the air was different. In the dungeons, it smelled of stone and antiquity. In the kitchen, of warmth and sweets. But here, outside, it was sharp, piercing, and alive. It was the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, a distant storm, and invisible life that wakes only when the sun hides behind the horizon. The moon, full and dazzlingly bright, hung in the sky like a vast silver eye, watching intently over the solitary figure of the wizard descending the stone steps towards the edge of the forbidden forest. Salazar did not hurry. His gait was measured, fluid, almost weightless. He knew that haste is the enemy of magic, especially the delicate magic he was about to perform. The forest, which centuries later would be named Forbidden and used to frighten first years, was not a place of horror for Salazar, but a temple. He knew its paths better than the corridors of his own castle. He knew the language of its inhabitants. For other wizards, the forest was chaos, a threat, something to be conquered or destroyed. For Salazar, it was a perfect system, where every element, from the smallest beetle to the giant acromantula, had its place and purpose. There were no lies here, no politics, no hypocrisy. Here, the strongest, the smartest, or the most patient survived. And Salazar respected this law above all else. He stepped beneath the canopy of trees, and the world instantly changed. The moonlight here shattered against the thick foliage, turning into a mosaic of silver spots on the black earth. The sounds shifted. Instead of the wind howling in the open, whispers reigned here. The whisper of millions of leaves rubbing against one another, the whisper of invisible wings, the whisper of roots slowly but relentlessly forcing their way through the depths of the soil. Salazar inhaled deeply. The scent of pine needles, mycelium, and wild mint tickled his nostrils. It was the scent of freedom. For a moment, he allowed himself to forget the quarrel with Godric, Rowena's dissatisfaction, the endless arguments about who was worthy of learning magic. Here, amongst majestic trunks that were older than Hogwarts itself, all those problems seemed as trivial as grains of sand at the bottom of the lake. He was not looking for just any clearing. He was seeking a place of power. The flower Noctis Pax Night Peace was a demanding plant. It did not grow where beast trails crossed, or where the earth was soaked in the blood of the hunt. It chose places of absolute energetic equilibrium. Places where the magic of the earth and the magic of the air met in a kiss. Salazar advanced deeper into the forest. His robes caught on low branches, but he paid no heed. He was listening, not with his ears, but with his entire being. He was searching for a vibration. Suddenly, a sharp crack came from the bushes to his left. Salazar froze. His hand reflexively, faster than thought, slid to the wand hidden in his sleeve. From the darkness, two yellow eyes stared at him. It was a young thestral, gaunt, skeletal, with leathery wings folded upon its back. Most people would not have seen it, but Salazar had seen death too often for it to remain invisible to him. The beast and the wizard looked at one another. The thestral showed no aggression, only curiosity. Salazar slowly released his wand. He felt no fear. On the contrary, he felt a strange kinship with this creature. Thestrals were feared, considered bad omens, harbingers of misfortune. Just like himself, people often mistake darkness for evil. Salazar thought, a thestral is not evil. It is simply a guide. It is part of the cycle. Soon, sleep. Salazar hissed in a language understood not only by snakes, but by all things belonging to the ancient chthonic world. The thestral blinked, snorted, releasing a cloud of steam into the cold air, and turned away, disappearing into the thicket as silently as it had appeared. Salazar continued his journey. The forest grew denser. The trees stood so close here that it seemed he was walking through a wall of living timber. Underfoot, a thick layer of moss sprang back, softer than the most expensive rug in the Slytherin common room. A peculiar, almost ringing silence reigned here. It was a sign. He was getting close. He emerged into a small clearing, hidden from prying eyes by a ring of old, twisted elms. It was a perfect circle. The grass here was silver with dew and moonlight. In the center of the clearing, on a small rise, grew a bush. It looked nondescript, almost dry, with thorny branches resembling wire. But Salazar knew, appearances are deceptive. True magic often hides beneath the simplest shell. He approached, trying not to even breathe loudly. On the clock of his internal sense of time, midnight was approaching, the magical zenith of the night. It was now, when the moon would be directly over the center of the clearing, that the Noctis Pax was due to bloom. For only a few minutes, Salazar sank to his knees before the bush. The cold dew instantly soaked his trousers, but he did not move. He took a small crystal vial and silver tweezers from the pocket of his robes. His hands, usually steady and sure, trembled ever so slightly. It was not from the cold, but from awe. He was about to witness a miracle. The wait began. For a man of action like Salazar, inactivity was the hardest trial. His mind was accustomed to constant work, building plans, devising strategies, analyzing spells. But here, before this bush, he had to switch off his mind. He had to become an empty vessel. The flower sensed tension. If he thought about the argument, about his grievance, about his ambitions, it would not open. It would sense the dissonance. Salazar closed his eyes and began to breathe. Inhale. He let in the peace of the forest. Exhale. He let out the poison of the day. Inhale. Coolness and the smell of earth. Exhale. Pride and stubbornness. Inhale. Exhale. He remembered Godric not as an opponent, but as a friend. He remembered how they had sat by the fire as young men, dreaming of a school where children would be safe. He remembered Helga's laughter when she had first baked a failed pie that was hard as rock. He remembered how Rowena, lost in thought, had walked into a door, forgetting to open it. These memories were warm, devoid of bitterness. They were pure. This was the state required. The state of acceptance. A faint sound, like the chime of a tiny bell, made him open his eyes. It had begun. On the dry, thorny branches of the bush, small buds began to swell. They glowed from within with a soft, pearlescent light. Slowly, incredibly slowly, the petals began to unfurl. It was like a slow-motion explosion of a star. White, translucent petals, more delicate than silk, opened to meet the moon, catching its rays. The fragrance hit Salazar's nostrils. It was a scent impossible to describe in human tongue. It smelled not like a flower, but like an emotion. It smelled of childhood, of a mother's embrace. It smelled of forgiveness. It smelled of the silence after a storm. Salazar felt a lump in his throat. This scent penetrated his very soul, dissolving the black stones of resentment he had carried within him for years. In the cup of the largest flower, at the very center, a drop glistened. This was it. Moon nectar. Just a single drop, clear as a tear, but thick as honey. Salazar held his breath. He knew he had only seconds. He brought the vial to the flower. His movements were fluid, like the flow of water. No sharp gestures. He did not want to take the nectar by force. He wanted to accept it. He gently tilted the flower with the tip of the tweezers. The drop trembled, caught the reflection of the moon, and slowly, reluctantly, rolled down, falling straight into the neck of the vial. Clink. The barely audible sound of the drop hitting the glass bottom seemed like thunder to Salazar. He quickly stoppered the vial. In that same instant, the light of the flower began to fade. The petals curled up, darkened, and fell to the ground, turning into ordinary grey ash. The magic was over, but it was now in his pocket. Salazar rose from his knees. His legs were stiff, his robes wet and muddy, but he felt as if he had just drunk the elixir of life. He looked at the moon and gave a barely perceptible nod, thanking it. The way back to the castle was different. Now the forest did not seem merely a place of peace. It seemed an accomplice. Every tree, every bush seemed to greet him. Salazar walked faster, feeling a surge of energy. In his pocket was not just a liquid. He held the key to Godric's heart, the key to peace in the school. But there was another thought that gave him no rest as he climbed the slope towards the black silhouette of Hogwarts. This nectar, it was too potent. If added in excess, the Marzipans would become not a reconciliation, but a love potion. They would force one to forget all grievances artificially, turning friends into will-less puppets forever smiling. And this Salazar did not want. He needed true peace, not an illusion. He would have to be even more precise than he had thought. He would have to balance on a knife edge. One drop for the entire dough, no more. Dilute it, dissolve it in butter, distribute it so that every molecule of nectar met a molecule of sugar. It was the higher mathematics of cookery. When he approached the secret entrance in the castle wall, he heard the familiar whisper of the wind again, but now there was no threat in it. Sweet peace. He spoke the password, and his voice sounded now not like the hiss of a snake, but like the rustling of leaves. The stones parted. The warm light of his kitchen enveloped him once more. The oven still held its heat. The dough on the table had risen and become fluffy as a cloud. It was waiting for him. Salazar placed the vial on the table, next to the almonds and sugar. In the light of the lamps, the liquid inside continued to glow softly, pulsing to the rhythm of the forest's heart. "Well then," he said to the dough, as to an old acquaintance. "Now we have a soul. All that remains is to give it form." He took off his muddy robes, threw them into the corner, which was entirely uncharacteristic of him, and washed his hands thoroughly once again. Now began the true alchemy. Not the search for ingredients, but their combination. The most difficult part lay ahead. For to bake a cake is simple, but to bake an apology without saying a word, that is an art accessible only to great masters. And Salazar Slytherin intended to prove that he was the greatest of them all. Returning to the secret chamber felt like returning to the womb of Mother Earth. If the forest was a breathing, unpredictable ocean of life, this kitchen was an island of absolute control and safety. The door closed soundlessly once more, cutting off all sounds of the outside world, and Salazar found himself in his kingdom of warm aromas. The dough was waiting. During his absence, it had changed. Left under a linen towel in the warmth of the magical oven, it had risen, breathing with its own life. Salazar approached the marble table and gently, with the tips of his fingers, lifted the edge of the cloth. The dough looked perfect, smooth, the color of ivory, with a barely perceptible satin sheen. It exuded a sweet, nutty warmth that instantly soothed the nerves. It was living matter, ready for transformation. Salazar placed the crystal vial of moon nectar on the table. The liquid inside continued to pulse softly with silvery light, like a tiny heart beating in unison with the rhythm of the moon, which was now hidden behind the thickness of the stone walls. The moment of truth had arrived. The moment when craft turns into art, and cooking into higher magic. Salazar did not hurry. He knew that the slightest mistake now could destroy everything. If the nectar were added just like that, it would burn the dough with its pure energy. It needed to be bound. A conductor was required. He took a small jar of clarified butter from the shelf, but this was no ordinary butter. It had been obtained from the milk of cows grazing on the clover-covered meadows of Scotland, and rendered over a slow fire to the singing, yes, precisely to the singing, of Helga Hufflepuff. Salazar would never admit to her that he had stolen a pot from her supplies, but he knew her kindness lived in this butter, and kindness is the best solvent for pride. He took a spoonful of butter, warmed it in his palms to body temperature, and unstoppered the vial. Commixtio anime, merging of souls, he whispered the ancient formula, usually used by alchemists to create homunculi, but here it served a different purpose. He tilted the vial. A single drop, heavy and radiant, fell into the pool of clarified butter in his palm. The reaction was instantaneous. The butter hissed, not from heat, but from magical resonance. A wave rolled through the room, invisible, but palpable, like a breath of wind. The silver of the nectar dissolved into the gold of the butter, forming a substance the color of dawn. Now it was safe. Salazar plunged his hands into the dough. He began to knead this magical mixture into the almond mass. His movements were rhythmic, almost hypnotic. He was not just mixing ingredients. He was imbuing them with thoughts. The dough resisted. It was thick and dense, just as his own soul resisted when it was necessary to admit a mistake. Press with the palm. I was wrong, Godric. The dough yielded, becoming softer. Turn, fold, press. Your bravery sometimes borders on stupidity, but without it we would never have built this castle. The dough began to glow from within, with a barely perceptible pearlescent shimmer. The nectar was spreading, penetrating every pore of the almond mass. Salazar worked with his eyes closed. He relied only on touch and smell. He felt the texture. It became silky, plastic, obedient. It no longer stuck to his hands, but seemed to caress them. The smell changed. The scent of the night forest, freshness, dew, and deep peace, was added to the aroma of almonds. It was the scent of reconciliation. Now the form, he said to himself, opening his eyes. He could have made them simple spheres or squares, but that would be too boring. For Godric, a symbol was needed, something he would understand without words. Salazar began to pinch off identical pieces of dough, weighing each in his palm. Exactly 30 grams, perfect balance. He began to sculpt. At first, he thought of making lions, but that would be too direct, even sycophantic. No, he formed something resembling a knot from the first piece, but it was no ordinary knot. It was a Celtic knot of friendship, without beginning or end, a symbol of eternity and unbreakable connection. His fingers moved deftly, pulling out thin strands of dough and weaving them into intricate patterns. It required jeweler-like precision. One wrong move, and the harmony of lines would be broken. While he wove these sweet knots, his memory obligingly supplied images. There they were, the 4 of them, standing on the hill where the main tower now rises. The wind ruffles Godric's red hair, Rowena traces something with her wand in the air, Helga laughs as she pours wine, and he, Salazar, looks at the black surface of the lake and feels for the first time in his life that he has found a home. Back then they were also a knot, different, contradictory, but woven together by a common goal. When did that change? When did ambition become more important than friendship? Salazar looked at the finished product on his palm. The knot was flawless. He placed it on a baking tray lined with parchment. One by one, new knots appeared on the tray. 12 pieces. 12 months in a year. 12 signs of the zodiac. The number of completeness. Now, fire. The oven was already heated, but this recipe required a special heat. Not the aggressive fire of a dragon, but the soft, enveloping warmth of a phoenix. Salazar approached the oven. He used no wood. He reached out his hand to the opening of the furnace and snapped his fingers. A flame flared in the depths. It was not orange, but golden pink. Salazar began to conduct it. He made smooth passes with his hands, forcing the flames to spread along the walls of the oven, creating a uniform cocoon of heat. Ignis amoris, fire of love, he whispered. Do not burn, warm, do not dry, preserve the moisture. He sent the tray into the oven and closed the heavy cast iron door. Now began the hardest stage. Waiting. Marzipans bake quickly. They need only to set with a crust, keeping the soft, chewy center. Overdo them by a minute, and they become rusks. Underdo them. They remain raw dough. Salazar sat on a high stool in front of the oven and began to watch the fire through the small inspection window. He saw the dough begin to grow. The knots filled with volume, becoming puffy. An aroma began to waft through the kitchen. Oh, it was not just the smell of baking. It was a symphony. First came the top note. Bright, festive almond. It reminded one of Christmas, of gifts, of joy. Then, the heart unfolded, moon nectar and vanilla. This smell was cool, like the night wind, yet paradoxically warm. It made one want to close one's eyes and smile. And finally, the base, the smell of baked butter and toasted sugar. The smell of home. The smell of safety. Salazar sat motionless, inhaling this magic. He felt his own tension, which he had carried in his shoulders for years, melting like butter in a pan. In this warmth, he allowed himself not to be the great Salazar Slytherin, but simply a man. A man who loves his friends, even though he does not know how to show it. A man afraid of losing what he has. A man seeking peace. He remembered Godric's eyes during the argument. There was not only anger there. There was pain. The pain of misunderstanding. I do not want a war with you, brother, thought Salazar. I just want us to be strong. But perhaps you are right. Strength is not only thick walls and pure blood. Strength is also the ability to trust. The cakes in the oven began to acquire a golden hue. Salazar sensed it intuitively. Time. He sprang up, put on thick dragon-hide gloves, the only element of his combat wardrobe in the kitchen, and opened the oven. A wave of hot, sweet air hit him in the face, forcing him to close his eyes in pleasure. He pulled out the tray. They were beautiful. 12 golden knots lay on the parchment, radiating a soft glow. They had not cracked, had not lost their shape. They preserved the perfect form. The traces of his fingers had disappeared, leaving only smooth, rounded lines. But the work was not yet finished. The final touch, the glaze. Salazar had prepared a bowl of lemon juice and icing sugar in advance. The tartness of the lemon was meant to offset the sweetness of the marzipan, to add freshness. He took a brush, made of hippogriff feather, soft and springy. While the cakes were still hot, He began to cover them with a thin layer of transparent glaze. It looked as if he were varnishing them. The glaze instantly set on the hot surface, forming a thin, crispy crust that shone like glass. Every touch of the brush was like an artist's signature. Swish, shine. Swish, perfection. Swish, beauty. When the last marzipan was covered with glaze, Salazar put down the brush and stepped back. He surveyed his work with the critical eye of a master. It was the best thing he had ever created. Better than any potion of luck, more complex than any poison. These cakes were materialized emotion. They were an apology that could be tasted. Salazar felt a sudden fatigue. The magical tension, concentration, emotional load, all of it crashed down on him at once. His legs trembled, and he leaned his hands on the marble table. But it was a pleasant fatigue. The fatigue of a creator who has finished his masterpiece. He looked at the clock, an hourglass in which tiny emeralds fell instead of sand. 5 in the morning. Dawn was coming. Time was running out. The castle would soon wake up. Elves would begin to bustle in the main kitchen, preparing breakfast for hundreds of hungry students. He had to hurry to carry out his secret mission unnoticed. Salazar took out a silver tray. It was antique, engraved with serpents biting their own tails, Ouroboros. Another symbol of cyclicality and renewal. Carefully, using a silver spatula, he transferred the still warm marzipans onto the tray. He arranged them in a pyramid. It looked solemn and simple at the same time. He hesitated for a moment. Should he add a note? He took a piece of parchment and a quill. Dipped the quill in the inkwell. His hand froze over the paper. What to write? Sorry, too banal. From Salazar. Unnecessary. They would understand anyway. Only he in the whole castle was capable of creating something so refined, at least so he liked to think. He put down the quill. No words were needed. The taste would say everything that was necessary. He covered the tray with a silver dome lid to keep the warmth and aroma. Well then, my little ambassadors of peace, he said quietly. It is your turn to act. Salazar extinguished the fire in the oven with a wave of his hand. The room began to cool slowly, but the scent remained. It soaked into the wood of the walls, into the stone of the floor. It became part of the history of this place. He took off his apron, carefully hung it on a hook, smoothing out non-existent creases. He put his heavy, austere robes back on. The moment of transformation. The baker vanished. The formidable head of Slytherin house returned. But in his eyes, usually cold and prickly, something new now shone. A tiny spark of warmth ignited by this night. He took the tray in his hands. It was heavy, but pleasant to the touch. Salazar approached the door. Exitus. Exit, he hissed. The stones parted again. The cold of the dungeon met him like an old acquaintance, but now it did not chill him to the bone. Salazar's inner warmth served as a shield. He moved through the corridors of the sleeping castle, carrying his sweet treasure in his hands. His steps were quiet. His shadow glided along the walls, but he no longer felt like a ghost. He felt alive. And he had a goal more important than any curriculum: to win back a friend. Dawn approached Hogwarts slowly, like an unwelcome guest hesitating to cross the threshold. The eastern sky behind the jagged mountain peaks began to turn gray, diluting the thick ink-black darkness of the night with the color of cold ash. The castle, that colossal stone beast, began to stir. Somewhere deep within the walls, magical pipes rushed, driving water to the upper towers. Portraits on the walls began to shift. stretching in their gilded frames and murmuring morning greetings to their neighbors. Ghosts, having finished their night watches, dissolved into the shadows, yielding their place to the living. Salazar Slytherin moved through the castle corridors like a shadow amongst shadows. In his hands he held a silver tray covered by a dome, beneath which hid the warmth of his sleepless night. His heart beat steadily, but a strange, ticklish sensation settled in his stomach, a mixture of anxiety and hope, familiar to every student before an exam, yet so unusual for one of the most powerful wizards of his time. He was heading not for the Great Hall, where students and teachers usually breakfasted. His path lay towards the small dining room, a cozy chamber in the east wing, which the founders had kept for themselves. It was a place without students, without politics, without formalities. A place where there was simply Godric, Rowena, Helga and Salazar. Friends. Or at least, where they tried to be. The corridor before the dining room was empty. Only suits of armor stood guard, and as Salazar passed, one of the helmets gave him a barely perceptible nod. Salazar did not reply, focused entirely on his goal. He pushed the heavy door. It opened without a creak. Salazar had personally oiled the hinges with a special lubricant a year ago, for he hated unnecessary noise. The room was drowning in semi-darkness. The fireplace, where embers had smoldered since the evening, was now dark, with only faint warmth still emanating from the stone. The long oak table, scarred by knives and time, stood in the middle, surrounded by 4 high-backed chairs bearing different crests. Salazar approached the table. He placed the tray exactly in the center. The silver glinted dully in the light of the morning dawn, breaking through the stained glass window. He lingered for a moment, his hand on the lid of the tray. He could feel the warmth of the marzipans through the metal. It was the warmth of his own magic, his intent. "Do not fail me," he whispered with barely moving lips. He could not stay. If Godric saw him here, next to sweets, the entire magic of the moment would be ruined. Godric, with his bluntness, would start joking, or worse, perceive it as weakness. Salazar Slytherin could not afford to look weak. His gift had to be anonymous, like fate, like a random miracle. He retreated into the darkest corner of the room, where heavy tapestries hung, and cast a chameleon charm on himself. His figure merged with the image of an ancient hunt on the tapestry, becoming invisible to the eye, yet still present to the world. The first to appear, as expected, was Helga. She entered the room, bringing with her the scent of herbs and fresh bread. Although she had baked nothing herself that morning, her face was tired, but her eyes shone with their usual kindness. She adjusted her yellow bonnet, sighed, and began to conjure over the fireplace, making the fire burst into cheerful, crackling flames. The room instantly became cozier. Behind her, stepping silently, entered Rowena. She looked as though she hadn't slept at all. In her hands was a scroll of parchment which she read as she walked. "Good morning, Helga," she said, not taking her eyes off the text. "Have you not seen my notes on the movement of stars? I believe I left them here yesterday after that conversation." The word conversation hung in the air like a heavy weight. They both remembered the shouting. "No, dear," Helga replied softly. "Sit down. You need to eat. You are quite pale." And then Godric entered. He did not enter. He burst in, though he tried to act quietly. The door thumped against the wall. Godric looked gloomy. His red beard was disheveled. Shadows lay under his eyes. He resembled a lion woken in the middle of winter. He offered no greeting, only grunted something indistinct and collapsed into his chair, throwing his head back and closing his eyes. The atmosphere in the room thickened. The tension of the previous day had not disappeared. It had simply slept for the night, and now woke along with them. "Tea?" Helga offered, trying to diffuse the situation. "Something stronger," muttered Godric. "Coffee." "Black. Like Slytherin's conscience." Salazar, in his corner, gritted his teeth but did not move. "Patience," he reminded himself. "Just wait." Helga placed cups on the table and finally noticed the silver tray in the center. "Oh," she marveled. "And what is this? I didn't bring this." "The elves?" She reached out and lifted the lid. The aroma escaped into freedom. In the small, cool room, it was like the explosion of a warm, sweet bomb. The scent of roasted almonds, vanilla, melted butter, and that elusive smell of the night forest instantly filled the space, displacing the smell of dust and the old fireplace. Godric opened one eye. Rowena lowered her scroll. Helga froze with the lid in her hands. On the tray, arranged in a perfect pyramid, shone 12 golden knots covered in transparent glaze. They looked perfect, too perfect for an ordinary kitchen. "What is that?" asked Godric, straightening up. His nostrils flared, catching the scent. "It smells. Merlin's beard. It smells like childhood." "It is marzipan," stated Rowena, examining the cakes with her analytical gaze. "But the shape, it is a Celtic knot, the sign of unity." "Who brought this?" Helga looked around, but the room was empty. Salazar held his breath. Godric's hand, large, calloused from the sword, reached for the tray. He took one cake. It was still warm. He turned it in his fingers, examining the complex interweaving of lines. "Well then," he said hoarsely, "let's not let good things go to waste." He took a bite. Salazar watched. He saw Godric's teeth break the thin, crisp glaze. He saw the expression on his face change. At first, there was surprise. Then, confusion. And then happened that for which Salazar had spent the night by the oven. Godric's face smoothed out. The creases on his forehead disappeared. His shoulders, which had been tense as a bowstring, dropped. He closed his eyes and began to chew slowly, with relish. The magic was working. Noctis Pax and Ignis Amoris were doing their job. It was not just a taste. It was a memory of the day they laid the first foundation stone of Hogwarts. The sun had shone then too, and they shared one loaf of bread between the four of them, and Godric had said, "We will build a home here." This marzipan tasted of that same feeling, the feeling of home. Helga and Rowena also took a cake each. "Oh," Helga exhaled. "This is incredible." "Is there a note of rose?" "No, it is something deeper. It is like an embrace." Rowena ate in silence, taking small bites, savoring every crumb. In her eyes, usually stern and cold, a moist glint appeared. "It is balance," she said quietly. "The perfect balance of bitter and sweet. Like life itself." They ate in silence for several minutes. The silence in the room changed. It ceased to be heavy and prickly. It became soft, golden, cozy. It was the silence of understanding. Godric finished his cake and reached for a second one. A faint smile played on his lips. "You know," he said suddenly, and his voice sounded completely different, warm and calm. "I lost my temper yesterday, spouted nonsense about cowardice." He looked at the marzipan in his hand. "Salazar is not a coward. He is simply cautious." like this nut. Hard on the outside to protect what is inside. Helga smiled, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a napkin. And I think that whoever baked this loves us very much. Whoever it may be, I know who it is, said Rowena, narrowing her eyes slyly. She pointed to the tray. Look at the precision of the lines. The perfect symmetry. There is no elf in the kitchens capable of such geometry. And I know only one wizard so obsessed with perfection that even dough submits to his will. Everyone looked at Slytherin's empty chair. Godric chuckled and then laughed. A deep, chesty laugh that made the window panes tremble. The old serpent, he exclaimed. Instead of simply saying, sorry, he fed us sugar. What a... Godric searched for a word, but there was so much warmth in his voice that offense stood no chance. What a complicated, stubborn, talented man he is. He raised his cup of coffee, saluting the empty chair. To Salazar, and to his paranoia, which might one day save our lives. Salazar, hidden beneath the tapestry, felt something inside him unclench, the knot in his chest that he had carried for years untied. They understood, they accepted. There were no humiliations, no oaths. Only the taste of almonds and the laughter of a friend. Slowly, step by step, he began to retreat towards the door. He did not need to go out to them. His presence was there, on the silver tray. His mission was accomplished. Returning to his secret refuge, Salazar felt an incredible fatigue crash down upon him. A night without sleep was taking its toll, but it was a good fatigue. The room still smelled of celebration. Empty jars, a dirty bowl, a sieve dusted with icing sugar. All this required cleaning. Usually, Salazar cleaned with magic, quickly and efficiently. But today he did not want to hurry. He walked to the copper sink, turned on the warm water, took a sponge and a piece of soap that smelled of lavender. He began to wash the dishes by hand. It was his meditation. The water washed away the remnants of dough, washed away the fatigue, washed away the last traces of anxiety. Every washed bowl was like a closed page of a book. He wiped the marble table dry until it gleamed, reflecting the light of the magic lamps. He put the jars back in their places, label to label. Hung up the sieve. Folded the towels. The kitchen was perfect again. Clean. Empty, but filled with the memory of the miracle created. Salazar Slytherin took off his robes, hung them in their place. He walked to the small sofa in the corner of the room, which he kept there for just such occasions. He lay down, covering himself with a throw. His body relaxed gratefully. His eyelids were heavy as lead. Before falling asleep, he thought about how the world knew him as a great and terrible wizard. And let it be so. Let them fear his name. Let them compose legends about his dungeons. But he would know the truth. And Godric would know. And Rowena. And Helga. The truth that magic is not only a wand and Latin. Magic is the ability to take bitter almonds, hard sugar and cold butter, and turn them into love. He snapped his fingers, and the last magic lamp in the room slowly faded, plunging everything into soft, velvety darkness. "Nox," he whispered. And for the first time in many months, Salazar Slytherin fell asleep without dreams. The calm and deep sleep of a child who knows they are loved, and that at home, all is well. Good night.